Now let's take a look at how we would type a function in Typescript. So let's define a function just called getSquare. It's going to be an arrow function that returns something. So let's call our variable here x, and we're going to take x, exponent of 2. And we can see straight away we get an error from Typescript. So parameter x implicitly has an any type. This is the same thing that we learned about before. And with strict mode enabled, Typescript isn't going to allow us to have any implicitly any types within any of our functions. So we'll have to add a type here. And well, JavaScript's a bit weird, right? So we could do a string or a number here. So what if we tried to type this as a string? Well, in Typescript, we can't actually. So we can see you get the error here. The left side of an arithmetic operation must be of type any, number, big int. In our case, we definitely always want this to be a number. So we'll explicitly type this as a number. And if I hover over getSquare, you can see getSquare is a function that takes a number and returns a number. If we wanted to be explicit about the return type, similar to how you are explicit about defining a type on a variable, we would just add a colon and then return number here. And you can see that number returns a number. And again, Typescript can infer the return type, so more often than not, you're not going to be adding a return type there. Sometimes it's helpful to be explicit. That's one of the ways you can add some documentation in your code and prevent people from modifying a function to return the wrong thing. But let's go ahead and define maybe a more complicated function. So let's say maybe we've got something called const handle API call, and that's equal to a function. And for its first argument, it gets a payload. And that payload is going to be an object, and that object is going to have a property, user ID, and that property is going to be a string. So you can see if I try to use my payload here, payload.userID. And I can go ahead and destructure payload, user ID. You can see the readability starts to suffer a little bit when we start destructuring and defining objects. We'll have some nicer syntax in a few videos, but what if we wanted to define a callback? So we've got another argument called callback. So that's a function, right? So how would we define a function, the type of a function that's the argument to a function? Well, similar to what you've seen up here. So this is a type definition, right? So we go function returns, let's say it's going to take our payload, it's going to get a user ID, straight string, and it's not going to return anything. So we've got a type that you're likely already familiar with called void. Void is the absence of a return. So of course, if we call this function, the result of that is going to be undefined. But in this case, when we type it explicitly at void, we can't use that return type anywhere because we're saying, hey, we don't expect this to return anything. It's just going to be called and then do something. So if we were to compose that together, for example, we do callback, and then we can take our destructured user ID and pass that straight in. If I don't pass in the user ID here, we get an error. Expected 1 arguments, but got 0. Go ahead and pass that in there. What if I actually try and call user ID? JavaScript, that would be valid. We'll try and call it there. Typescript, of course, knows we can't call a string. There's no call signatures. It's not a function. So this is just a brief example of how we can add types to our functions in Typescript.